April 17, 1945. 10:47 a.m. Southampton Docks, Hampshire. The gangway creaked under wet boots. Margarete Schulz stepped onto British soil, her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform stiff with salt spray and 3 weeks of accumulated fear. Around her, 67 other women descended in silence, each convinced she had perhaps an hour to live. The propaganda had been explicit. Capture meant execution, or worse. Margaret's hands trembled as a British sergeant approached, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable behind regulation mustache and steel-rimmed glasses. If this story challenges everything you thought you knew about World War II, hit that like button and subscribe. Comment below where you're watching from and what aspects of wartime Britain surprise you most. This channel exists because the most powerful history is the history that contradicts our assumptions. And what happened to these women would shatter beliefs on both sides of the barbed wire. The sergeant checked his list, nodded to the translator, and said something that made no sense. Medical inspection first, then tea. Margaret glanced at the woman beside her, both searching for hidden meaning in those words. Medical inspection, that could mean anything. But tea? The absurdity of it registered as terror. Then she saw the canvas tent, the 2 nurses with Red Cross armbands vivid against khaki, and the complete absence of rifles pointed in her direction. One nurse smiled. That smile would undo 2 years of certainty about what strength meant, what enemies did, and what happened to women who lost wars. For 26 months, Margaret had absorbed a consistent narrative. The Signals Corps training near Bremen had included weekly indoctrination sessions. Capture by Western allies meant systematic brutalization. The film showed burned villages, executed prisoners, women subjected to coordinated violence. British soldiers, they were told, had been conditioned by propaganda to view German women as legitimate targets for vengeance. American forces were depicted as even worse, undisciplined, racially diverse, incapable of restraint. The stories circulated in whispers among the women stationed in occupied France. Girls who fell into enemy hands simply disappeared. No letters, no repatriation, no trace. By 1945, every woman in Wehrmacht auxiliary services understood capture as death, just death preceded by deliberate humiliation. So when the collapse came in early April, and British forces overran their signal station near Calais, Margaret had steeled herself. She'd rehearsed what she would say, how she would maintain dignity, where she would look when the moment came. What she encountered instead was a British lieutenant who checked their identification papers, confiscated their equipment, and ordered them loaded onto trucks for transport to the coast. No violence, no speeches, just the bureaucratic efficiency of a military machine processing prisoners according to regulation. The journey to Southampton took 3 days. They were held in a temporary camp near Portsmouth, given adequate rations, and processed through Allied intelligence screening. Still, Margaret waited for the cruelty to begin. It never did. The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and boiled wool. A British doctor, perhaps 50, graying at the temples, examined Margaret's hands, calloused from signal equipment, and asked in careful German if she had injuries. She shook her head, unable to reconcile his clinical detachment with what she'd been taught to expect. He checked her eyes, throat, lymph nodes, made notes on a form, then gestured toward a chair where a nurse held a tin mug. Hot tea, actual tea, with sugar dissolved in it. Margaret accepted the mug but didn't drink. It had to be poison. Or a test. See which prisoners were weak enough to accept enemy charity. The nurse noticed her hesitation and took a sip from her own cup, meeting Margaret's eyes. It's just tea, love. You're safe now. Safe. The word arrived in English, then German translation, and finally emotional comprehension. Margaret drank. The warmth spread through her chest, down into her stomach, and for the first time in months, the trembling in her hands stopped. She looked down at the mug, standard issue British tin, dented on one side, the kind a soldier might carry through an entire campaign. Years later, in letters that would span 3 decades, she would describe that mug as the object that saved her life. Not because it held tea, but because it represented a choice. Someone had decided that even enemies deserved the basic dignity of warmth. That choice demanded explanation, and explanation required Margaret to question everything. Britain's treatment of prisoners of war was not accidental kindness. It was policy, built on 4 pillars that senior command enforced with bureaucratic precision. First, security. Prisoners behind wire posed no tactical threat, and cruelty created resistance while decency created compliance. Second, intelligence. Cooperative prisoners provided information, while brutalized prisoners invented lies or maintained silence. Third, reciprocity. German forces held tens of thousands of Allied POWs, and treatment given was treatment expected in return. Every Red Cross inspection of a British camp became leverage for inspecting camps in Germany. Fourth, principle. Britain had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929 and intended to be seen honoring it, even when the enemy did not. Especially when the enemy did not. By April 1945, Britain held over 400,000 German prisoners on home soil. Mortality rates in British POW camps remained under 0.3%, a figure sustained by adequate rations, medical care, and strict enforcement of international standards. The War Office had calculated this precisely. A German prisoner in Britain received approximately 3,000 calories per day when assigned to work details, matching the rations of British agricultural workers. The food wasn't luxury. Boiled potatoes, tinned meat, bread, margarine, vegetables when available. But it was sufficient. Sufficient was a revolution. Sufficient meant prisoners gained weight instead of losing it. Sufficient meant the propaganda had lied. At the processing center outside Southampton, Margaret and the others received new blankets, prisoner identity tags, and photographs for documentation. A British officer explained camp rules in slow, grammatically perfect German. No escape attempts, no destruction of property, compliance with work assignments. Medical staff would visit weekly. Male privileges would begin after initial screening. Violations meant loss of privileges. Persistent violations meant solitary confinement, but, and this was emphasized, physical punishment was prohibited. Guards who struck prisoners faced court-martial. The officer said this matter-of-factly, as if discussing laundry schedules. Margaret heard it as the collapse of an entire worldview. They were loaded onto trucks and driven north to Shropshire, to a repurposed country estate that now served as a facility for female auxiliary personnel. High fences, yes. Guard towers, yes. But the barracks were weatherproof, heated with coal stoves, equipped with proper latrines and washing facilities. That first evening they were served dinner on metal trays. Boiled potatoes, tinned beef, 2 slices of bread with margarine, weak tea. It wasn't abundance, but it was more than Margaret had eaten in a single meal in weeks. She ate slowly, methodically, unwilling to let her body believe this could be sustained. Around her, younger women wept silently into their plates. Another sat motionless, staring at the bread as though it might vanish if she blinked. No one spoke. The silence wasn't peace. It was cognitive dissonance suspended between expectation and reality. Margaret finished her meal and returned her tray to the collection point, where a British soldier, barely 20, freckled, looking profoundly bored, nodded and said thank you, in English then German. Danke. The casual courtesy shattered something. Margaret walked back to her bunk, lay down fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep. Sleep required trust, and trust required understanding. And understanding seemed impossible when everything she'd been taught had been systematically inverted. Within a week, work assignments began. Britain's farms were critically short-handed. The war had drained rural communities of young men, and the Women's Land Army could not meet demand alone. German POWs, male and female, became essential to the 1945 harvest. The War Agricultural Executive Committees coordinated prisoner labor across the country, matching skills to needs. Margaret's group was assigned to a dairy cooperative in Shropshire. 12 women tasked with milking, mucking stalls, and processing milk into butter and cheese under supervision of a farmer named Harold Hargreaves. He was 63, weathered, spare with words. On the first morning, he showed them the milking parlor, demonstrated the equipment once and said, "You'll work 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. You'll be paid in camp scrip. You'll be treated fairly if you work fairly." Then he left them to it. Margaret had never milked a cow. Neither had most of the others: signals technicians, radio operators, administrative clerks. But they learned quickly, driven by the unspoken understanding that failure meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was more frightening than hard work. The cows were patient. The routine was clear. By the end of the first week, Hargreaves grunted his approval. "You'll do." It was the first compliment Margaret had received from an enemy. She found herself absurdly pleased. The work was honest. The supervision was firm but not cruel. At the end of each day, they returned to camp with enough energy to write letters, mend clothes, or simply sit by the coal stove with mugs of tea. The mug again. Always the mug. It became Margaret's anchor to sanity, proof that this strange new reality was not fever dream or elaborate deception. British authorities allowed prisoners one outgoing letter per week, subject to censorship. Margaret wrote carefully, aware that anything she said could be used for propaganda by either side. But she also wrote truthfully. "I am treated fairly. We work on a farm. The food is adequate. I am not beaten. I am not starved. I do not know when I will come home, but I am alive." Her mother's reply when it arrived in July was written in shaking handwriting. "We were told you were dead. The Red Cross informed us in March that your unit had been overrun and no survivors were reported. I wept for you for 3 months. Thank God. Thank God." Margaret realized, holding that letter in the dairy barn while rain drummed on the tin roof, that the propaganda had poisoned both sides. Her mother had believed the worst about Allied treatment. Margaret had believed the worst about her own fate. Both had been wrong. And that wrongness was the crack through which doubt could enter, and doubt could grow into questions, and questions could dismantle the entire architecture of certainty that had sustained them through 5 years of war. Harold Hargreaves's wife was the first civilian to breach the distance. 3 weeks into the work detail, she appeared at the dairy with a basket of scones, still warm from the oven. She set them on the workbench, looked at the women, and said simply, "Tea time." Margaret hesitated. The others hesitated. Mrs. Hargreaves poured tea from a thermos, added milk, and handed the first cup to Margaret. "Go on then. It won't bite." They ate in silence, prisoners on one side of the workbench, Mrs. Hargreaves on the other. But the silence was different now, less wary, more human. Over the following months, small gestures accumulated. A borrowed coat when rain turned cold. An invitation to Sunday dinner in the farmhouse kitchen, where the Hargreaves' daughter served roast chicken and asked polite questions about Germany, about peacetime, about what Margaret hoped to do after the war. None of it was required. None of it was policy. It was something harder to name. The quiet decision, repeated daily, to see enemies as people. By autumn, Margaret was trusted to drive the tractor unsupervised, a task that required both skill and discretion. She could have sabotaged equipment. She could have fled. She did neither. The work mattered, not because it served Britain, but because it proved something to herself, that her labor had value, that competence transcended nationality, that she was more than what the war had tried to make her. In July, one of the women, a signals technician named Hilda, developed a severe infection in her hand from a cut sustained during farm work. The camp medical officer examined her and immediately ordered hospitalization. She was transferred to the civilian hospital in Shrewsbury, where she shared a ward with British patients recovering from surgeries and illnesses. The nurses treated her wound with identical care: clean dressings, sulfa drugs, attentive monitoring. Hilda recovered fully within 10 days. When she returned to camp, she was subdued. One evening, she told Margaret, "The nurse asked if I had family. I said yes, a brother. She asked if I'd heard from him. I said no. She said she hoped he was safe. And she meant it." Hilda paused, staring into her tea. "I don't understand them." Margaret understood the confusion. The propaganda had prepared them for cruelty, which could be endured with hatred intact. It had not prepared them for decency, which demanded a reckoning. If British soldiers and farmers and nurses could choose restraint, could choose to honor the conventions of war even when their own cities had been bombed, what did that say about strength? What did it say about civilization? The questions were dangerous. They undermined not just the regime, but the entire psychological framework that had made the war possible. Christmas 1945 arrived with snow and peculiar tension. The war in Europe had ended in May. The women were no longer enemies in any tactical sense, but they were not yet free. Repatriation was delayed by logistics, paperwork, and the sheer scale of displaced persons across a shattered continent. On Christmas Eve, the camp chaplain, a mild Anglican minister with a limp from the First War, organized a carol service in the camp's makeshift chapel. Attendance was optional. Margaret went, mostly from boredom. The chaplain opened with Silent Night, and the British guards at the back joined in. Then he switched to German. Stille Nacht. The women sang tentatively at first, then with gathering strength. And when the final verse ended, there was silence so profound Margaret could hear snow landing on the roof. The chaplain distributed small parcels after the service. A chocolate bar, a pair of wool socks, a packet of biscuits. From the parish, he said. They wanted you to have something. Margaret held the chocolate and thought of Christmases before the war. Her mother's kitchen, her brother's laughter, the smell of Lebkuchen baking. She cried quietly, and no one stopped her, and no one looked away either. The British guards stood at attention, respectful, until the women filed out into the snow. It was, Margaret would later write, the moment she understood that the enemy had not defeated Germany through superior cruelty. They had defeated Germany by remaining human when it would have been easier to become monsters. By spring 1946, restrictions had loosened considerably. Margaret and several others were allowed supervised walks beyond the camp perimeter on Sunday afternoons. Eventually, the supervision was dropped. They walked the Shropshire lanes in pairs, breathing air that smelled of hawthorn and fresh earth, and no one stopped them. They could have run. The hedgerows offered cover. The villages offered anonymity. But where would they go? Germany was rubble. Repatriation was coming. And truthfully, life in the camp had settled into something bearable, almost routine. Some women began volunteering for extra shifts during harvest season, driven by a strange pride in their competence. Harold Hargreaves noticed. One evening, loading the last milk cans onto the truck, he said, "You've done good work here, better than I expected." It was the closest thing to affection he'd ever offered. Margaret nodded. "Thank you," and meant it. Late at night, lying in her bunk with the tea mug cooling on the floor beside her, Margaret turned the question over and over. If the propaganda about Allied cruelty was false, and it was demonstrably, incontrovertibly false, what else had been a lie? The necessity of the war, the righteousness of the cause, the demonization of the enemy. She didn't have answers. But the questions themselves were dangerous, destabilizing, freeing. Years later, in a letter to Mrs. Hargreaves, one of dozens exchanged over 3 decades, Margaret would write, "I learned more about strength in that camp than I ever did in uniform. Real strength is not domination. It is restraint. It is the choice to be decent when cruelty would be easier. You and your husband taught me that, though you never said it aloud. The lesson was quiet, but it was permanent." Repatriation began in earnest in early 1947. Most of the women returned to Germany, uncertain of what awaited them. The country was divided, destroyed, occupied. Families were scattered. Homes were ruins. A few chose to stay in Britain temporarily, accepting contracts as agricultural workers while they saved money, or waited for information about conditions back home. Margaret stayed until autumn 1947. She worked the harvest one last time, attended a final Sunday dinner with the Hargreaves family, and accepted a small parcel for the journey, tea, biscuits, and a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice with a note tucked inside. "Remember that decency is always a choice. Safe travels. Write, if you can." She did write. For 30 years, the letters traveled back and forth, awkward at first, then warm, then familial. Margaret rebuilt her life in Hamburg, married a teacher, raised 2 children. She never spoke much about the war, but she kept the tin mug. She kept it on her kitchen shelf, dented and unremarkable, and sometimes when her children asked about it, she would say only, "It's from England." It reminds me that people are complicated. The war had taught millions that strength was violence, that victory required vengeance, that the enemy was less than human. But in a camp in Shropshire, in a dairy cooperative, in a farmhouse kitchen, a different lesson was taught. Not through speeches, but through small, repeated acts of restraint. Tea offered, wounds tended, work respected, dignity maintained. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was something harder, civilization choosing itself, even when brutality would have been easier, even when brutality would have been justified. Margaret learned that strength is not what you do to your enemies when you have power over them. Strength is what you refuse to do. The measure of a nation is not its weapons, but its restraints, not its capacity for violence, but its commitment to principle when principle costs something. In 1945, Britain had every reason to abandon those principles. British cities had been bombed, British soldiers had died by the hundreds of thousands, British civilians had endured years of rationing, fear, and loss. Vengeance would have been understandable. Instead, Britain chose the harder path. It chose to honor treaties even when the enemy had not. It chose to see prisoners as human even when propaganda had made them monsters. That choice was not weakness. It was the most powerful assertion of strength imaginable. The tin mug sat on Margaret's shelf for 40 years. She drank from it every morning. And every morning she remembered that the distance between civilization and barbarism is not geography or ideology. It is choice. The choice to maintain standards when abandoning them would be easier. The choice to see humanity when hatred would be simpler. The choice to believe that how we treat our enemies defines us more than how we treat our friends. In a world that had descended into mechanized slaughter, systematic genocide, and total war, that choice mattered. It mattered then. It matters now. When Margaret died in 1987, her children found dozens of letters from England, carefully preserved in a wooden box. They found the tin mug wrapped in newspaper, and they found a note, written in her careful handwriting. I was taught that enemies were animals, but animals do not offer tea to prisoners. Animals do not choose restraint. I met the enemy, and they taught me what it means to be human. The war ended decades ago, but that lesson never will.